Hi, and welcome to the slideshow and lecture for Module 9, where we will be talking about the artist named Titian. He is another of these Venetian painters that we have covered in Module 8, and we will also be covering in Module 10. Some of the key points today that we'll be talking about include the fact that Titian is a very popular court painter. He works for a huge number of patrons, really all over Europe. His style becomes very, very popular, and patrons start wanting to collect his works, not just commission works from him, but actively collect works that he had already executed. We also see him working with a facility with both secular and sacred subject matter. He seems as comfortable with mythological scenes as he does with religious and devotional pieces. And finally, one of the other major things about Titian is that his style changes pretty dramatically throughout his career. So his career, he works for a very long time. He lives to be quite old. He works primarily in Venice, although as Vasari noted, he does take a number of trips throughout Italy, and he's working for pretty much the entirety of his life, from his apprenticeship with Giorgione all the way until his death in the 1570s. So there's lots and lots of works that survive by him, and we'll be talking about a good number of them today. So Titian works in a variety of ways. He is more of a storyteller than his contemporaries are. In his religious commissions, he's known for a very active approach to his religious paintings. He's a fantastic example of the new style of Venetian painting that started in the early 16th century. Specifically, his works have a great sense of luminescence, so that interest in light, the ability to capture certain lighting effects that we talked about, which is a real interest in Venice because of things like mosaics, glass production, and the water that makes up Venice's streets. Again, we also see with Titian this important innovation in Venetian painting of poesia. Remember, that means that painting is supposed to operate in the indirect manner of poetry. So painting should be like poetry. And I want to start with this painting, generally referred to as Sacred and Profane Love, dating quite early in his career to 1514. What we see in this painting is a combination of landscape painting and mythology, which is quite characteristic of Venetian art. Notice that he's put his figures in the landscape, just like the Bellini did, just like Giorgione did. This work was almost certainly commissioned by a man named Niccolò Aurelio, who was a member of one of the Venetian government councils. And this was commissioned to celebrate his wedding with a woman named Laura Bagarotto. And scenes like this were quite typical of marriage paintings. Remember, I've talked about that in the past with Botticelli. So ideas about love, notions of fertility, and often nude figures show up in these marriage paintings. Based on its shape, and it's actually quite large. I don't have the exact dimensions here, but I would say that it measures about 5 feet long and then maybe 2.5 to 3 feet high. Based on its shape, it probably decorated a piece of furniture. So it might have been part of a marriage chest, which is what a woman would put most of her physical objects of her dowry into, and they would be processed through the streets. Or perhaps it served as a headboard or was set into another piece of furniture. Now, looking at this work, there's something that you should notice about these two women. If you look at their faces, it's actually a depiction of the same woman in two different guises, as two different kinds of love, which is where we get our title Sacred and Profane. I often like to ask in a classroom setting about this work, which one is sacred love and which one is profane love? I would say that 80% of the time people say that the nude woman is representing profane love and the clothed woman would be sacred. In fact, it's the opposite, because in the Renaissance, this idea of sacred and profane meant earthly. So someone tied to the earth, tied to domestic responsibilities. So we see the woman on the left clothed in this beautiful garment, probably her marriage costume. In the background, you might notice this fortified structure that looks much more residential than the architecture in the background to the right side. There you see what looks like a church, indicating the divine quality of this figure on the right side. So this might be two representations of Venus, the earthly Venus and the heavenly Venus. In this work, we have these beautiful contrasts of textured with the nude woman's flesh and her drapery and the sumptuous nature of the earthly Venus's gown. She appeals to the earthly senses specifically because of her gown and her open bodice. This also can serve as a representation and celebration of sexual love in marriage. There's all sorts of symbols of fertility including here, especially in the flowers that the earthly Venus holds in her hand, those flowers that are growing up in front of this sarcophagi. In the background, you might notice that this little baby who's swishing its hand around in the water of this sarcophagus actually has wings, so it's probably supposed to be Cupid. That's another sign of love in this context. Other signs of fertility include the stallion represented on the sarcophagus, and then maybe the most famous symbol of fertility in the world are this pair of rabbits right here in the background to the left, because marriage is all about the production of children in the Renaissance. So it's a very interesting work that combines a decorous and appropriate, erotic, yet moral message. And so we see these two facets of this woman, these two facets of what a woman is expected to do in marriage. So it's a very good example of Titian's early style of painting. You see the paint is very tightly handled. There's not a lot of sense of the brush stroke of the artist. It looks like a window into another world, which is something different than what we'll see in his later works. I now want to move to one of his most famous works of art, and that is this very, very large altarpiece called the Assumption of the Virgin from the Church of Santa Maria Gloriosa dei Frari in Venice, and this is the major Franciscan church in Venice. He becomes extremely well known for this work, and it encapsulates the notions of monumentality and drama. And this is the commission that solidified Titian's status as Venice's foremost painter. The subject comes from the dedication of the church to the glorious Virgin. So that's what Santa Maria Gloriosa means, glorious Saint Mary, and dei Frari refers to the Franciscans at the church. What we're seeing in the Assumption of the Virgin is something very shortly after her death, where you see the apostles gathered around at the bottom, who were all said to be miraculously called to her bedside as she lay dying. And then you see the Virgin Mary occupying the central space here, standing on this cloud, supported by this huge group of angels who are all looking upwards, just like Mary does, to God the Father, who circles above her, seems to fly down from the heavens to greet her. So you've got three really distinctive realms here. I wanted to show you an interior view of what the Frari looks like so you can get a sense of just how huge this altarpiece is. Now, one of the things this image isn't showing, unfortunately, is that in the Frari, the choir screen actually still exists, and it's right behind where this photo has been taken. So this is a huge, huge, huge church, very long nave, where now the viewer is standing in front of the choir screen, but this painting is so big that a viewer entering the church, completely opposite the apse that we're looking at, would have been able to see this altarpiece all the way from the back and even through the choir screen. So it would have sort of drawn you to the holiest part of the church. It focuses the attention on the high altar of this very large church. So it's a very bold composition. It's very clear what's going on through the gestures of the figures, and there's a clear articulation of color and light. So the disciples on the bottom, who are all in very different poses, very carefully organized. Also, notice the nice balance of color that Titian is using on either side of the central axis. They act as a foil to what is going on above. They're very, very large figures. This is up above where the viewer would stand, so the viewer would know to look upwards through these large figures who have all sorts of lines of force going on with their arms raised. All of their gaze is looking upwards to the Virgin in the very center. And the fact that she's in her very typical red and blue drapery in front of this golden backdrop really highlights her. And then we follow her gaze up even higher, up to God the Father, and it's very clear what's happening in this work. And this was an important event in Franciscan theology, and so that makes really good sense why this is here. This is the largest altarpiece that was painted in Venice, and I believe the largest altarpiece painted in Italy in the Renaissance. It's just massive. The figures at the bottom are over life size to give you a sense of the scale that we're dealing with here. And just for a moment, I wanted to compare it to another work that we've looked at, Raphael's Transfiguration, which dates just a little bit later than Titian's altarpiece. So Titian's trip to Rome doesn't happen until after Raphael's Transfiguration is painted. So I'm not comparing these because there's a direct influence going on between them, but rather to show you the differences in approach between Central Italian painting and Venetian painting. These make a really nice comparison because you've got these different layers going on, the stratification of the figures. The apostles on the bottom in the Raphael work, remember, they're presented with this possessed boy that they're wanting to heal, but they say, no, that can't happen. And at the top, you've got this completely separate event of Christ's transfiguration. And there's some communication between the layers, but it's not reciprocal necessarily. Whereas here, you've got very similar tools being used by the artist, compositional elements, formal elements being used to guide your eyes upward, just like in the Raphael piece. But in some ways, the Titian work is more harmonious. It all works together in a way that Raphael's is more split apart. But I think one of the most noticeable things about the differences in these painting styles is the different approach to color versus drawing. So this colore versus disegno that I've talked about a couple of times now. So you can see the way that Titian is building up these figures through the application of glazes, these layers of paint, whereas Raphael's figures are a bit more harshly drawn. You can see the light source is much stronger. The whites, the highlights are much, much brighter. And Titian's has this soft light suffused throughout. So it's a very different approach to painting between central Italy and northern Italy. Shortly after Titian is commissioned to paint the high altar of the Frari, he's also commissioned to paint this altarpiece for one of the side chapels in the nave. And this stands on the left side of the nave as you're walking from the doorway up towards the high altarpiece. In this work, we see Titian showing his ability to nicely articulate architectural space. And in many ways, this work is quite revolutionary for resolving some of the issues involved in placing so many figures within a relatively small altarpiece. And he solves this problem by placing the composition on a diagonal. So we see the diagonal line compositionally starting from the lower left, working upwards through St. Peter, who is seated here. You can tell by his keys that are dangling down around his feet. And this line continues up to the enthroned Virgin and Child. The Christ child looks down at these Franciscan monks who are standing down below him, and these monks gesture to this family gathered at the bottom right, who are the Pesaro family. And this diagonal actively draws in the viewer as he or she is walking up the aisle. Because remember I said this is on the left side, so the viewer would approach from behind, and then you'd be able to see into this space. You've got this verticality heightened by the huge columns that he has employed, but by putting all the mass at the bottom with all of the figures involved here, it is really strongly anchored as well. And so there is a vertical thrust, but it's quite well balanced, especially because you have these really highly saturated reds used in the clothing of the figures and in this nice counterbalancing diagonal of the flag being carried here. Now, the content of this piece incorporates both doctrinal and familial concerns. It's quite complex, actually. This is an altar that's dedicated to the Immaculate Conception, but this altarpiece really has nothing to do with that dedication. The patron of the work, Jacopo Pesaro, was a commander of the papal fleet, and this altarpiece is probably commemorating a 1502 victory over the Turks. So within the altarpiece on this flag, you see the arms of the Pope, Alexander VI, who was the Pope at the time of this 1502 battle. You also see the patron himself. He's the one kneeling over here to the left in this more dominant position, acting as the beginning of our diagonal. And behind him, you see this turbaned man who is representing the converted Turks. So the successful military campaign in 1502 successfully converted several Turks. Again, you have Peter in the middle, which is interesting doctrinally because it's this really nice representation of how the church stands as the intermediary between regular people and the divine. So this Christ and the Virgin who are up here seated, like we've seen in many Venetian altarpieces. They look down towards the patron, but that gaze passes St. Peter, who stands in to represent the papacy and the church as a whole. This work is often cited as a transition piece between the ideals of the Renaissance, so a very nice balanced composition, and a new Baroque style, which often incorporates the diagonal. But this is quite early to really be considered a transitional piece, but it is showing Titian's advances in the arrangement of a composition. While we're talking about Titian's religious works, I wanted to jump forward in time quite a bit. So this is almost 30 years later than the Pesaro altarpiece that I was just showing you. I wanted to show you a work from his later career to show you just how differently he approaches different scenes at different points in his career, but also in different contexts. So this is painted in a completely different mode, and we see an attempt here at a nocturnal scene. So this is in a Jesuit church in Venice, and it's in the first altar on the left side as you enter the church. So the viewer is going to see this first kind of from this lower left point, just like with the Pesaro altarpiece, although the viewer will be more immediately straight on than he or she would with the Pesaro, which is about halfway up the aisle of the church. The night setting of this work, of the martyrdom of St. Lawrence, makes it extremely dramatic, especially with the light cast by these torches that are being held at the foreground and the middle ground, and then that opening up of the sky where Lawrence looks towards, gestures toward with his arm, and he can see his impending sainthood. So the story of Lawrence is that he was an early Christian martyr in Rome who refused to sacrifice to the pagan gods. And so, according to legend, the way his martyrdom occurred was that he was ordered to be slow roasted alive. And that's what we see going on here. You can see the fire being stoked by this person over here to the left. You can see these other figures representing the Romans carrying wood in to make sure that this martyrdom can take place. You see on the right side all of these soldiers making sure that this occurs as it is supposed to. And Lawrence is in some ways this very nice idealized classicizing nude, and this figure to the lower left in many ways should remind you of some Michelangelesque figures. And it is before this point Titian actually does go and see Michelangelo's work in Rome. You know, in the background you have a very nice classical setting. You've got a statue of a god set up here on an altar, and some nice classicizing architecture over to the right side to show this happening in front of a temple. So the classicizing setting is appropriate to the historical period of when Lawrence was martyred. It's also probably derived from a poem by Prudentius, who was a Roman Christian writer, and he was published in Italian in Venice in the Renaissance. And Prudentius wrote, quote, "The death the holy martyr died was in truth the death of the temples. That day Vesta saw her Palladian house spirits deserted, and no vengeance follow. All the Romans who used to reverence Numa's libation cup now crowd the churches of Christ and sound the martyr's name in hymns." That's the end of the quotation. So on the left side, we do see Vesta depicted here, and this little idol she's holding is referred to as a palladium, so this image that protects the city. Titian does set this work on a diagonal, much like the Pesaro, although it goes much more into the background rather than upwards to the immediate right like we saw with the Pesaro. My favorite detail of this work, which is right at about at the height of the viewer, is this fire that's being stoked below, because fire is one of the most difficult things to depict in a painting or in a sculpture. So it's really interesting to see how Titian's looser brushwork later on in his career is really ideal for depicting fire. So Vasari talked pretty extensively about how Titian painted a huge number of portraits. And I wanted to show you a few of those, including this very famous work, which is a portrait of Isabella d'Este dating to 1534. Titian worked for the d'Este family in a couple of different contexts. And what's really interesting to me about Isabella, well, first, she was a significant patron of the arts and one of the first major female patrons of the arts in Renaissance Italy. Now, she served as regent, ruling over Mantua until her son came of age. we know quite a bit about her, and a number of her letters survive. And she is one of the first people who actively seeks works of art because a certain person painted them. So rather than seeking out an artist to commission a work from him, Isabella d'Este wrote specifically about Titian that she wanted something done by Titian. She wanted a work that he had done. She wanted to buy it. So it's a really different conception of the artist that begins with people like Isabella d'Este and other important collectors. The other d'Este that Titian works for, I mentioned in the lecture on Bellini and Giorgione, and that is Alfonso d'Este. He was actually the younger brother of Isabella, and he was the Duke of the city of Ferrara. Now, Ferrara and Mantua are both in the northern area of Italy, so it's not that far for Titian to go to work for either of these patrons. Now, remember, Alfonso d'Este is the one who commissions a couple of different rooms to be decorated by painters. First his studiolo, and then also a room he called the Camerino dell'Alabastro that had alabaster decoration covering the walls. And in this room, this is where we're supposed to see works from Bellini, Titian, Fra Bartolomeo, and Raphael. Remember, we looked at Bellini's Feast of the Gods that is actually finished by Titian and another artist, Dosso Dossi. Now I want to show you several works that Titian completes for this same patron. The most famous of these is this painting, Bacchus and Ariadne. And this is executed between 1522 and 1523. It's a very interesting painting and has been very well studied by art historians. So on the left side, we see the figure of Ariadne. In the very center, we see Bacchus, who is in the middle of leaping from his chariot. It's actually this really strangely static pose for such a dramatic and dynamic action. And I always think it looks like he's about to fall over rather than safely land on the ground. So he's jumping out of this chariot that has been pulled by these two leopards. And you see all of these attendants of Bacchus who are having a sort of bacchanal themselves right now. You see this woman playing the cymbals. You see this little fawn dragging the head of a mule. In the background, you also see this figure who's carrying the leg of some kind of animal. And then one of my favorite figures that shows up in mythological scenes, that's Silenus. He's this drunk fat guy who always shows up with Bacchus. So the story of Bacchus and Ariadne is that Ariadne had been abandoned by her husband Theseus, which is a much longer story in and of itself. You can see Theseus's ship over here to the left side. And Bacchus leaps from his chariot to greet her, and she's sort of reciprocating, looking towards him, but her posture indicates that she's rather wary of what's happening here. I want to talk about some of the details of the entourage that we see here. I misspoke before. I called these leopards, but in fact these are actually cheetahs, and these cats are something that Titian would have seen in Alfonso d'Este's famous menagerie of animals. In many ways, it's sort of like a sarcophagus frieze of figures. So looking at a classicizing mode to present all of these figures in the Bacchanal. And they're doing, as I said, they're playing music. They're dragging the head of a stag and holding its leg as this symbol of the frenzy of Bacchus's father. So it's a really chaotic scene. You can see why Ariadne might be a little bit wary of what's going on here. It's painted in very thick layers, which reproductions don't really attest to, but it's really a fascinating painting to understand Titian's working technique because they've done a lot of scientific studies of this painting. And so, for example, they took a cross section of paint, that's where they insert a hypodermic needle and draw out just a bit of the layers of paint, specifically on the shoulder of Ariadne. And in that sample, they found something like 9 or 10 different layers of paint and colors you wouldn't even expect to be there. So lots of blues and reds, of course, but also blues from the background, colors of the flesh tone, and even some orange in there in order to build up the colors as he saw fit. So Titian is famous for this slow application of glazes in order to create a luminous quality, but also to use this layering of paint to create new pictorial effects of color. So even though this is a bit of a frenzied scene, there is a calm resolution in sight, which is indicated by the calmness of the sea, these clearing clouds, and the constellation that's up in the top left, which is commemorating the peaceful marriage of Bacchus and Ariadne. And I just wanted to show you the other images that Titian painted for Camerino d'Alabastro of Alfonso d'Este. They include this Bacchanal of the Andrians, so more mythological scenes, more bacchanals, more revelry and drunkenness, which is an interesting theme for all of these paintings to have. And so far, they do all have this. Even the Feast of the Gods has some licentious qualities to it. And then the last work that he does is this painting called The Worship of Venus, where you see the statue of Venus on the upper right, and then just dozens of little Cupid figures or putti who are all just going crazy and having quite the time themselves. So it's another sort of, not exactly a bacchanal because they're not all sitting there drinking wine necessarily, but they're all just having a great time playing in this wilderness. And these works become very, very famous and eventually are sent to Rome and copied by a number of artists in the 17th century. Titian also worked for the Duke of Urbino, specifically for the Della Rovere family, and this is his most famous work executed for them. So the Della Rovere family became very wealthy while Julius II was Pope because these were his heirs. They ended up being adopted by the Montefeltro of Urbino as their heirs because the male line there had run out. So this painting is quite interesting because it can be seen as a pseudo-mythology, since the contemporary documents about this painting just call her a nude woman. They don't refer to her as Venus. And if you look at this work, there's really no indication that she is supposed to be this goddess. She's not in a poetic landscape like we've seen before. For example, with Giorgione's Sleeping Venus, there's no landscape scene here. And Titian really extends that idea that perhaps this Venus is a contemporary figure. Remember I talked about that with her drapery lying on the ground? Well, here we have her set in a Renaissance palazzo, and she's here putting herself on display for the viewer. Again, as with his earlier works, we see a study of textures and how light plays across them. So you've got these really varying textures depicted in the bed sheets and the fabric that the bed is made up of, this green velvet curtain in the background, the tapestries hanging on the walls, the marble of the window frame, the fur of the dog, the tile of the floor, the skin of this nude woman lying in front of it. It really is a study in contrasts. It's a very elegant depiction with the arrangement of her hair, the fact that she's wearing jewelry both in her hair, earrings, a bracelet, and a ring. She seems rather dispassionate, although she does connect with the viewer through eye contact. She's still rather a passive recipient, especially with the way her head is slightly turned. She's not really staring back at you, she's just making eye contact with you. In the background, you see two servants digging in these chests. These are called cassoni. These were what dowries would be kept in, and they are probably looking for clothing for her. So we can see what maybe the next moment in the action is supposed to be. You see this dress thrown over the shoulder of one of the figures. Perhaps she's waiting for her attendants to help get her dressed. So this is possibly supposed to be representing a mistress. And it recalls for sure Venetian courtesans. That was a very famous culture in Venice at this time. It seems like she's looking for male companionship. So there was this distinct contrast between the expected role of a wife and a courtesan. And without knowing the context of the work, it's really impossible to try to explain what's happening here. But there's lots of indications that we're looking at a portrait of a figure, perhaps the Duke of Urbino's mistress. She's really not Venus, though, because she's set in a contemporary palace. She's got the figures around her in contemporary clothing. And we've got all sorts of symbols of lust, including the dog that's lying on her bed, her posture, her passive gaze, and again, that action of her left hand, very much like Giorgione's Sleeping Venus. So it's a complex work. It's incredibly beautiful to look at. And this title that it gets, Venus of Urbino, is really an excuse, a reason why she might be nude. And this work of art becomes extremely influential, especially into the 19th century. So it's another really good example of this tradition of reclining female nudes in the Renaissance. As I said, Titian also works for a number of international patrons, including Pope Paul III, who you are seeing here. And Vasari writes quite a bit about Titian's time in Rome, working for the Farnese court, working for the Pope himself, where we see this portrait here Again, it's got that really luminous quality, the velvet of his cope that we're seeing here. A Venetian artist is perfect for this, capturing the essence of what velvet looks like. He does a number of other portraits of Paul III and his nephews as well. While in Rome, he stays at the Vatican and he works on the portraits while staying in the Villa Belvedere, which remember is built by Bramante and houses the antiquities collection of Julius II. Titian also works for the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V and also for Philip II of Spain. For a couple of these different patrons, he does a series of the loves of Jupiter, so the major Roman god Jupiter. We'll look at a couple of these that he does. They're both in the Prado today. These are very sensual images. They're very highly erotic, and they're considered acceptable because they are from mythology, and they demonstrate classical inspiration. We see a different approach to painting in his later works, so starting even as early as the 1540s, where the brushstroke is less controlled and it seems much more spontaneous. We see Titian focusing even more on color rather than design or drawing, so much more colore than disegno, where you don't have any harsh outlines for anything. Everything is built up through these thin glazes of colored paint. So I wanted to start with this work here. This is showing the story of Danae, who was one of the loves of Jupiter. Danae was a princess, and her father had received a prophecy that his daughter's son would end up murdering him. So he decided to lock Danae in a tower so she could not ever have a child. Eventually, Jupiter, because he is the king of the gods, finds a way around that, and he comes in through the window in this golden shower. And it's often shown as this burst of light, and you can see Titian also representing it as these coins that fall from the sky. So I wish I had a detail of this paint for you, because it's just incredible how it's just loose brush strokes showing this opening of the sky and this golden light emerging from these murky clouds. So with Danae, we see again this reclining nude figure. In many ways, she's rather Michelangelesque. She recalls a painting that Michelangelo did that Titian probably saw while he was working in Rome. It should also recall to you, though, the Venus of Urbino, the fact that she's on this bed. Again, she has a dog, the symbol of fertility. And again, at the upper left, we've got this curtain that looks like maybe it's supposed to go over the painting, which was a typical thing that collectors did with their works, but maybe it's just surrounding her bed. We see her rather receptive to what's going on here. She clutches the sheets. We see her other hand reaching in between her legs, and then her maidservant is here collecting the coins. So they're really rather active in their involvement here. Another work that Titian does for Philip II in this series of the loves of Jupiter is this work called The Rape of Europa, and this dates just a little bit later than the Danae for the same patron. So Europa was a nymph that caught the attention of Jupiter, and in order to kidnap her and subsequently sleep with her, as Jupiter did, he transformed himself into a bull. So that's what we're seeing here in the major focus of the composition, Europa sliding, hardly holding on to this horn of the bull. She seems hardly able to even situate herself as they move through the water and are about to take off into the sky. You've got these two Cupid figures who are following them, sort of dancing in the air. Another little Cupid riding a dolphin down here, accompanying them on their way. And then over to the left, you see this detail of where Europa came from. Her attendants are waving to her, hoping that she comes back. It's a very sexually charged image, just like the Danae. Europa is rather scantily clad and is shown in complete disarray with her legs splayed open. She seems to be trying to right herself on the bull's back, but in presenting her in this way, it's a really rather sensual image. Titian's work is in sharp contrast to earlier, more sedate versions of this subject. It's really very dramatic and active, and it seems like complete sexual abandon. We see Titian working in a very thick impasto. An impasto is the Italian term for the technique of building up really thick splotches of paint on the canvas. It's much more painterly than Titian's earlier works. His earlier works are much more tightly handled. There's no visible brushstroke, whereas here in his later works, it's all about the brushstroke. The friends on the shore are hardly even delineated. So here I'm showing you a detail of those friends on the shore. You can really get a sense of the weave of the canvas coming through the paint. You can see how, in order to show these clouds and to show a highlight on them, he just dashes on some yellow paint. And these three figures are hardly even sketched out. They're just globs of paint, essentially. We see in the background the landscape just evanescing into the sky. I mean, we can't even really call this atmospheric perspective. It's this complete giving over of light and brushstroke in order to indicate some kind of setting. And then I don't have a detail of it, unfortunately, but if I were to show you a detail of the head of the bull, especially this wreath and the fur, the way the fur has been articulated here, it's done with a completely loaded paintbrush. So Titian would have loaded up with white paint and just daubed it on, which is the same thing happening with these fish down at the bottom and the foam of the water. It's just daubed onto the canvas very, very thickly, very quickly. Titian is not concerned with blending his paint. He's exploiting the physical texture of the paint so that light glints off of the surface in a way that if you had smoothed out the brushstroke, it would not allow. Titian becomes very well known for this technique, and it's something he does very purposefully. It's not that he's working fast. In fact, we know quite a bit about his working method, where he would often work up a layer of glazes, and then he would turn the painting towards the wall of his studio, lean it against the wall, and then leave it for months at a time. And then he would come back and do another layer of glaze. So he would let them dry really considerably in between layers. And patrons start to make comments about this. So for example, we have a letter written by one patron who commissioned a work from Titian and sent it to a friend. And in this letter that this patron writes to the friend, he writes, okay, so I'm sending you this wonderful painting by the wonderful Titian. Just don't look at it too close up. You need to get a little bit further back. So they were very aware that they had a sketchy quality. And that's something that earlier in the Renaissance was considered unfinished and inappropriate. But starting with the works of Titian, you start to see a much looser handling of paint. And if you think about it, the works of people like the Impressionists could not have happened without Titian's experimentation with using a very loaded brush. I have just a couple more works to show you today, and the two that I end with today both seem to be produced entirely by Titian for himself. So there's no specific commission attached to these. Often what he would do is he would produce works in his studio, and then he would let clients into his home and show them samples. So he would produce works without commission necessarily. In both of the following two works, we also have instances of Titian including self-portraits in the works. So the first one I'm showing you here is called The Flaying of Marsyas. This is a work that's done very late in his career. It shows the very gruesome death of the satyr Marsyas, who's here strung up from this tree. You can see the red ribbons tying his ankles to the trees because he is in the process of being skinned alive. So Marsyas was a satyr, as I said, who challenged Apollo to a musical contest. You don't challenge a god to a contest, you're going to lose. And Marsyas's punishment for challenging Apollo and losing was to be skinned alive. This work may have been inspired by a 1571 event where a Venetian nobleman named Marcantonio Brigadine was flayed alive by the Turks, and that became very well known and infamous in Venice. It's this very graphic and gruesome scene. So Marsyas is the center of our canvas here. You see some other attendants of Apollo, one in the background playing a violin of sorts. And then kneeling down here, we have Apollo himself, nearly nude, shown with a laurel wreath, and he is actively cutting into the skin of Marsyas, as is this other attendant with the black cap here. There's other very gruesome details, such as the dog at the bottom here, lapping up the blood that drips down Marsyas's body. We see Apollo very intensely concentrating on the work at hand, meticulously cutting off the skin. And this figure in the background has even been considered another version of Apollo. He looks pretty similar here, playing the viol. On the right side, we have some other figures, another dog, another little satyr. and another faun here, or perhaps another satyr, so attendants of Marsyas. And then the seated figure, who's rather royally dressed, and notice his crown, is supposed to be the figure of King Midas, who's contemplating the scene. Now, King Midas' most famous story is where he decided to request that everything he touched be turned into gold. Eventually, he comes to find that that is a horrible idea, and one of his punishments is that he has to wear donkey ears the rest of his life, and they're very hard to see here, but that is what indicates him here as Midas. And in fact, shown as King Midas contemplating the scene is a self-portrait of Titian. So in this massive, massive canvas where the figures are about life size, the viewing is really intense, and it's handled with very loose brushwork, and you've got a very interesting juxtaposition of colors and again of textures. So if you look at the skin of Marsyas, the skin that's about to come off, you can see how mottled it is, how Titian just seems to be daubing on different colors of paint in order to evoke the texture of skin, and that's true for all of the figures throughout here. What I find most interesting, perhaps of all, though, is that Marsyas's face, he's really rather dispassionate. He doesn't seem to be in too much distress, and he's accepted his fate at the hands of the god. So this is a really striking work to see in person. The last work I want to talk to you about today is the very last work that Titian works on, and it is left unfinished at his death in 1576. This is generally referred to as Titian's Pietà, because in the center we have the Virgin Mary with the dead Christ on her lap. This work, as I said, was left unfinished at his death, and it is very likely that he was painting it for his tomb decoration. This is another monumental canvas like the Marsyas, and within this Pietà, we see the theme of redemption, especially because it's being used as a tomb monument. There's a lot going on here besides the Pietà here, but it really is the focal point, especially because look at the luminescence that radiates from the head of both the Virgin Mary as she contemplates her son, and then the head and the body of Christ. It seems like light just emanates from Christ himself, as well as the heads. They don't need halos because they have these auras of light around them. To the left, we see Mary Magdalene, who seems to be rushing forward in her grief. She can't even look and contemplate the death of her friend. The angel that you see flying above here with the torch, and then some of the architectural features, especially up here at the top, are actually added after Titian's death by a man named Palma Giovane, who was one of his students. Again, as with other works by Titian, we see a composition based on the diagonal, beginning here instead of the lower left, like we saw in two cases, here at the lower right, with this balding penitent figure who's perhaps supposed to be St. Jerome. It's not entirely clear, but the fact that this statue is seated on the base of a lion and the fact that he's wearing red seems to indicate Jerome. Here we have another self-portrait, and this penitent figure is rushing up to the dead Christ, clutching his hand, and the juxtaposition of the heads is very, very interesting and would have been very appropriate for his tomb monument. So in this, we see that Titian's penitence and his own personal redemption as the central themes of the work. You see two very large statues standing on either side on these lion-headed bases. And then one very interesting detail over here to the bottom right, you see this small panel painting propped up against this base, which is supposed to help us identify the penitent as Titian. So to include a painting, which was what represented this figure, this penitential figure, it's a really interesting thing for him to include, I think. This architectural sort of setting also features in the very center of it a mosaic. And at the center of the mosaic, this is hard to read, but what we're actually seeing here is a pelican surrounded by its young. And part of the legend of the pelican was that if it could not feed its children, it would pick at its own breast. And you can see that that's in fact exactly what it's doing. It's got its neck curved, picking its beak at its chest in order to let its blood feed its children. And this was seen as a very common symbol of Christ because it's a very similar activity of Christ. It's also a major symbol of charity. So this is another very good example of Titian's late, very painterly style. You can see how loosely the brushwork is handled here. It gives it this luminescence and this immediacy that if the brushstrokes were very refined, we might not see. So I will end here with this work today. I hope you've learned quite a bit about Titian's long career, where he's working in a couple of different modes, from a very tight brushstroke to a very loose one later on in his life. He is as skilled at creating mythological scenes as he is with religious scenes, and he works for a huge number of patrons, not only in Venice, but also throughout Italy and even throughout Europe. So he's a very, very important painter of the Renaissance. And if that TV show, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, had been doing its job right, it wouldn't have been Michelangelo, Raphael, Leonardo, and Donatello. It would have been Michelangelo, Raphael, Leonardo, and Titian, because he is the fourth major painter of that time period. So he's an extremely important artist whose reputation is quite good, but would be even better if Vasari hadn't been so biased against non-Tuscan painters. So thank you very much for watching. Now please take the self-assessment quiz that is posted and work on the discussion board in your other writing assignment. Thank you.